Welcome to episode 6 of The Model Philosopher. In the last episode, I talked to Jean-André about colour, and our conversation mostly concerned colour in dioramas, and due to my own background perhaps, scale models. During that conversation, Jean and I touched on figures, but I thought it'd be really good to talk to a figure modeller about colour to round out the conversation. The painter I chose is Tue Kaae. Tue is someone I met last year at Scale Model Challenge when he took part in the figure painting panel discussion Tracy Hancock and I recorded for the Sprue Cutters Union podcast. I was really impressed by how deeply Tue thinks about what he does and how articulate he is in discussing it, and that's exactly the kind of creator I want to bring you for this podcast and blog. Before I get on to the interview, I just want to remind you that The Model Philosopher is sponsored by the world's leading hobby show, the most exciting event in the model calendar for figure modelers, armour modelers, diorama modelers, aircraft modelers, ship modelers and every other kind of modeler, Scale Model Challenge. Scale Model Challenge is not just a show, it's a full rich event that celebrates the hobby and craft of modelling with a world-class competition with over 3,000 entries every year, where everyone from beginners to the leading modellers in the hobby come to show their work to their peers. They have a programme of 14 workshops from leading modellers and painters, including Gerard Broom, Eric Swinson and Jean-Bernard André, where you don't just get to hear what they do, you get to work on a project with their instruction and personal guidance. There are over 150 unique vendors selling everything from kits to limited edition figures, to tools, to aftermarket, to diorama accessories, and everything else you might need for your own miniature masterpiece. And all in a phenomenal conference venue, easy to reach by air, road or rail, with the world famous, in modelling circles, Abbey Bar. It's the show you should never miss, Scale Model Challenge. Check out the details at scalemodelchallenge.com or look up Scale Model Challenge on the socials. Okay, back to our interview. Let's dive in and hear from Tue. Welcome to The Model Philosopher, Tue Kaae. Thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here. Very happy for the opportunity. You're supplying a reach to an audience that I don't normally have a chance to talk to. So I'm super happy to be here.
Well, I'm hoping modelists of all kinds, for want of a better word, are going to get something out of this podcast. It's not quite as subject-driven as the Sprue Cutters Union podcast that I did in terms of being aimed more at modelers rather than figure painters or something else. It's more about the concepts, and I think the concepts can be universal. But that being said, I hope people have listened to the last episode where I spoke to Jean-André about colour, and he spoke from a diorama point of view. But I was very conscious, you probably noticed it, I think you did, while we were talking, that we had a kind of a bias in favour of dioramas and models.
Mm-hmm.
And given that colour is something which I think is far more developed in figure modelling and figure painting circles, I wanted to get someone on to talk from that point of view. Now, I saw your work, first time I remember seeing your work was at, very recently, because I'm a bit late to the party, at World Model Expo, and I was really struck by the use of colour you did there. So I got in touch and we decided to get you on and talk from your point of view.
Yeah. So with historical modeling, I think the base premise, the sort of the merit that everyone has agreed that is to be achieved, is about correctness. So it's about getting the right color. It's about, museum grade is like a really high praise. So everything is about getting things right. Where the base mindset in my end of the fantasy painting is to get things exciting. So the whole idea about what we as a community have decided is merits to be achieved, they're just very different. They're not better or worse, but it's just a very different mindset. I don't care if the orc is green or red or brown or whatever, as long as it looks cool.
I think I did chuckle slightly there, if anyone heard. The reason for that, when people say it's museum quality, most of the models I've seen in museums are pretty awful. So it always makes me laugh when people say that like it's a good thing.
I reflected on that as well.
But it is. I mean, it's a phrase which people take, to have a meaning, which is that it's great.
Yeah.
Now, as with colour accuracy, this is something I came across a lot particularly in aircraft modelling, because I used to edit Scale Aircraft Modelling magazine for Guideline Publications. And there was a lot of talk about scale color accuracy to the point where it was important to the exclusion of everything else. And I think that is the idea of accuracy and realism in air quote marks, because realism is an objective, to me, is an objective value judgment. It's not a subjective, value judgment. It's not an objective truth, because
Yep. Yep.
how realism is observed changes person to
Yeah,
person.
you touched on
But
that
anyway,
with Sean as well.
caveats aside, because I'm getting diverted already, I think it's something that is changing. Certainly, from my own point of view, I'm not so interested in color accuracy anymore in military modeling.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in telling the truth, by which I mean sort of the emotional truth and the story truth, than I am in making the model completely accurate.
So
So,
many people think that accuracy is truth,
mm,
and they might be right, but I think it's a very, very boring version of it. I mean, all the history, all the story that we get told is subjective as well. Stories told by the victor.
oh, don't get me started on that. I don't I don't believe in that phrase. It drives me mad. Um, I think that's something people say, but it's not actually always true. If it was, then we wouldn't have the Confederate lost cause thing, and we wouldn't have neo Nazis telling us that the Germans were far more powerful than they actually were, and things like that. So, um, to a certain extent, yes, but also no.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're going to get we're going to get distracted again. This is going to be one of those conversations where we
Yep.
constantly go off all over the place. But for me, the way it works is a fact is something which is observably so from various different points of view. So a fact is something that people can agree on is a fact, is a
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm.
A truth is an opinion that you form of the fact based on the fact. So a truth is something that feels right to you, but isn't necessarily shared by everyone else. Everyone can have kind of their own idea of what's truth, but facts are facts, if you see what I mean. So one's subjective, which is truth, and the other is objective, which is facts. But it's basically semantics, and this isn't really an English semantics talk.
But
So I don't really want to get into that.
I find language fascinating and interesting, and to me, fact and truth are the same thing.
To most people, they are.
Yeah.
Perhaps I separate them just because it suits me for my argument. Who knows?
Yeah.
But you did say something else there, which was more important and something we should get back to. Remind me, what did you say about color in fantasy?
So fantasy people, in general, there's okay. So yet another aside, the
Mm,
fantasy painting community is sort of splitting at the moment, kind of similar to the way that fantasy broke off from historical, like 20 years, 30 years ago. There's two different main directions that fantasy painters go into. So I'm clearly and firmly in the fantasy art, like miniature art direction, and I want to do less and less trope stuff, less and less like fantasy stuff. And there's a faction that it's led by Games Workshop and Golden Demon and that whole crowd. And that one is actually by now relatively close to uh, the correctness of the old school historical stuff. So you are starting to get Warhammer rivet counters, like people who put down your paint job because you put the wrong logo on the knee pad of the Space Marine, and then it doesn't matter how well you paint it because you made a mistake, and that is not the way that it's supposed to be. So,
well, when they created the lore, and there's hundreds of books now,
mhm,
I know I've been reading some of them. They're quite good, some of them. But when they created that, they created a history basically for their
yeah,
fantasy universe,
yeah,
and it's an incredibly detailed history,
yep,
which has mostly a strong continuity to it.
yep,
A strong canon. So essentially, it's historical modelling, just the history's made up.
yep. Yep, it
But it
is.
has the same restriction, like you say, doesn't it? That if you want to paint an ultramarine, you should use Macragge blue because
Yep,
that's the correct blue for an ultramarine,
yep.
and any other blue is incorrect and stuff. And so
And
you get these restrictions they've created for themselves.
yep. And they did that because it's a company and they want a coherent marketing. They want you to instantly see that it's a Games Workshop miniature. They have all kinds of motivations about that, but it means that it spills down into the miniature painting as well.
Mm.
So personally, I would much rather see a brown or red orc because it's more interesting. Um, I mean, green can be interesting as well. But in that other direction, orcs need to be green. So I'm speaking very much from my side of that fence. I
Mm.
think we'll get a stronger and stronger division between the two. Not that the relation between the two groups will be divisive, but there's a definite just different currents, where some people want a much more miniature art and emotive and artistic approach to it, and a lot of people, I think the majority of people, prefer the um, escapism world building thing.
It
Um,
may surprise you, but a similar kind of thing is happening in scale modeling and history modeling as well.
yeah,
That there are some people, mostly diorama makers,
yeah,
that want to do something artistic
yeah,
and um, emotive and that tells a story. Even if the story is based on history, they want to. The story is more important
yeah,
than the colors and so on. But most people want to make an accurate thing based on the rules
yeah.
and so on. So I think in a way it's kind of similar. It's really interesting that fantasy's done that though, because it didn't need to do it, if you see what I mean, because you're starting out from something created, something
It's because
imagined.
Games
You
Workshop
would
is
think
so strong.
maybe it's just something about people.
Yeah,
Some people like rules,
yeah.
some people don't like rules.
I think so. I think so. I'm very very happy to hear that it's happening in the historical community. I
Hmm.
had a feeling that it was. Um, I think that the whole. I'm gonna rant now. Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it. We love rants.
So I think that there's a lot of gatekeeping in the historical community. We're
Yeah.
getting quite a bit in the fantasy one as well, but most of the sort of base infrastructure in historical is made
Hmm.
around. Um, so if you don't do things the way that Shepard Payne would have done, you're doing it wrong. You can modernize some of the techniques, but there's some very, very set in stone merits that you have to stick to. And if you're painting your tank pink, the first question isn't, "Oh, that's interesting. Why did you do that?" The first interaction is, "You did it wrong."
Hmm.
And I think it's a really really unhealthy way to build communities, and it's a very common way to build communities. Um, and I think that fantasy, at least my side of the fantasy, are way better at that. And having that much more free mindset about what you can do, it's much more about how you can interpret the produced stuff in an interesting way. It definitely started with diorama builders, just as you're saying, but there's a definite pull in the opposite direction.
Hmm.
The problem is that there's a lot of money in it now as well, and especially at competitions, it's very very clear that there's a lot of money in it, and money is steered by consumers, and consumers have no taste and no taste for something new and something different. They basically just want whatever they've been told the past years that they should want. It's why pop music is forever there. Um, so
I think it's
yeah.
kind of true, but I also think that people don't know what they want until they see it. And until they see it, they think they want what they can already get. So I
Hmm.
think
Yep.
you need risk takers
Yep.
to show them something new.
I agree.
But the risk is you won't make any money. And as long as there's money involved,
Yep.
people are risk
I'm
averse.
I'm extremely privileged that I can spend a lot of hours doing the things that I do, and I don't
Mm.
need to sell them. The problem is that most of the people who paint to a very high degree, they do that for a living, and
Mm.
they need to sell whatever they're making. So they're tied to the money. They can't just take out 2 months and do their own thing, because so many of them either are already professionals. We have a lot of professionals now, or they want to be professionals, and then they need to follow the current. Um, so I'm doing something that is very different than most other people, and I'm privileged enough to be able to do that. I mean, generally, I don't sell my pieces. I sold 2 pieces, I think, and those were relatively random because
Mm.
I spend a lot of time. I'm not mainstream. I don't have a large social media presence. I don't have the things that you need to have in order to make a lot of money on it. I just do these things. Don't even really do them for myself that much. I do them in order to show people a different way.
Mm.
I'm the risk taker, and I think uh, challenging the standards is way more interesting than doing something that everyone agrees look pretty.
We should probably get onto the subject that we're supposed to be here to talk about.
About money.
Now,
Oh,
talking of your work,
color.
well, see, this is something that I could do a whole episode about, and I think we, some point in the future, we need to.
Yeah,
Because I should tell you, there's no money in the historical modelling side. Maybe in the historical miniature side,
yeah,
but not in the historical modelling side. No one pays anyone to do anything. There's no money in it at all, and yet they still put restrictions on themselves.
yeah.
So, but anyway, so color plays a big role in your work, which is
Yes,
why I
it
asked
does.
you on. So, where do you get your inspiration for color from? Is it from art? Is it from nature? What has the biggest influence on you in color?
Um, it's definitely not miniatures,
Mm.
but it's a very, very wide-ranging thing. I get a lot of inspiration from um, mostly digital painting. Um, I think there's a lot of inspiration in oil paintings and the old stuff. Um, I generally want more contrast than you get in the old stuff. I mean, Rembrandt paints fantastic portraits, but there's not a lot of color in it, and you can develop a palette that is very harmonious, like Rembrandt, and get wonderful things out of it. But you're choosing not to use the color contrast as a tool in your arsenal. And I would rather use all the tools that I have access to. So I get a lot of inspiration from like 10, 15 different 2D illustrators. That's mostly where things come from. But I mean, almost all of my stuff is I see some little doodle or half an illustration, and then I think I remember how it looks, and when I look at it again, it doesn't look anything like I thought it did, but I'm just running with that idea. But mostly I get my inspiration from illustrators. I do quite a lot of, so I would call them love letters to artists. Not fan art as such, because fan art most of the time is 3D versions of 2D artwork, and I'd much rather play with their style and their palette and do love letters to their style instead of doing copies of their work. So I do that a lot and study the way that they use colors.
I don't know if you listened to the first episode with Carmen Tan, but we said in that art is a conversation.
Yep,
That
yep,
that when you do something, you're opening a conversation, and you're inviting the viewer to respond to it
yeah,
with their own thoughts and so on. It sounds to me like what you're doing is having a conversation with the artist. They're saying something, and you're responding to that. If you see what I mean,
yeah,
in the same
yeah,
language,
yeah,
in their own language.
definitely. And I want to have the conversation with the viewer of my stuff as well. So I use color a lot, but I use color as my premium tool to steer attention. So contrast is very, very important. But if you're just using contrast for contrast's sake, it's kind of pointless to me.
Mm.
To me, it's all about the narrative, it's all about the story, the person, and you're using all the different things like matte and gloss, dark and light, saturated and desaturated. All those things are tools that you use in order to push the narrative. But I do use color a lot for that.
Mm.
Um, I think a lot of people think that more saturation and more color, this is especially true in the fantasy side of things. A lot of people just think that more is better. But it means that you get a miniature where everything is taken to 100% saturation and all the different colors are fighting each other. And then it's just really busy and really messy, and there's no calm spots. You need stuff that grabs attention and have lots of contrast, either value or saturation, and you need areas that are more dull. And the dull areas, I would argue, is actually more important than the bright ones, because they're the ones that set it up. You can't really have light if you don't have dark. If you just have more light, then it's just a wash.
I sometimes think of it when I'm editing the sound on this, or if you look at the waveform of music, good music has some high end, some mid end, and some bottom end.
Yeah,
And if you there's no bottom end, it sounds tinny,
yeah,
and there's no sort of driving power to it. If you take the top end off, it sounds murky, muddy, and there's no sort of
yep,
sharpness to
yep,
the music at all. It's very sort of flat, and it's the same, I think, with light and color. You need all three. I've said it before about color, about being muddy, with no with everything in the mid range and not enough in the top and the bottom.
yeah,
But I think if you don't have it balanced, not just light as well, but as you're saying with contrast, areas of low contrast and areas of very high contrast and
yeah,
so on. If there isn't balance to it, then it never works really.
yeah. I use framing a lot as well, and I use colors for
Hmm.
framing. Um, so
You
the
tell us what you mean by framing.
so framing is color placement. So
Hmm.
to me, everything is about focus management. It's about getting the viewer to look at the stuff that you want them to look at. Um, my seminal piece about that is my space camel, the one with the orange backdrop, where I pulled out all the boats. Um, there's a lot of that miniature that is very rough because there's a lot of areas that are really fine around the rider. And if you have a fine and defined section, the eye naturally goes towards that. So you can do it with color, you can do it with value, and you can do it with detailing and all kinds of different things. So I'm using framing for that miniature, for instance. There's a few metallic parts. The metallic parts are chrome, so it's the Molotov chrome. They're really, really, really shiny, but they're all arranged in a circle around the main focus. So I'm framing the circle, the focus with these metallic bits. If you have a miniature and like if you have a, a figure in an A pose, then you do light on the hands and light on the face, but the face should be a little bit lighter. That way you'll have a triangle with the focal point being the top of the triangle. And that will mean that you naturally look at the face. That is framing. Um, Doing a light face and like a light scarf, but a black line between the face and the scarf, that is framing. So you're basically making frames around what you want people to look at. Mostly round frames. And they're never like complete frames, but they're like dotted frames.
There's enough there to create the effect without being too obvious
Yeah,
what you're doing.
yeah. If you're doing a miniature that's standing on a road, you make sure that the road section that they're standing on is brighter or darker or anything. You're making a circle on the pavement. It's not terribly realistic, but hey, it's a pavement. It could be any color. And by making it lighter around a dark figure, you're creating that framing to pull the eye towards that.
If you're doing it well, I don't think people notice.
No,
It's when you overdo it that it becomes obvious.
it's one of my favorite things to play with.
Mm.
So if you do highlights, so you can do highlights if you have the same A pose miniature, then you do highlights on the top of the sleeves, and on the seam on the top of the shoulder. And if you make them a little bit more pointed there, you're actually painting an arrow.
Hmm.
So the long along the sleeves and then the shoulder thing. And
Saying, look here.
you can actually just paint arrows on your miniature. And you can be very, very obvious and brash about it. You can just paint arrows on the miniature to point to what you want people to look at. And people are not going to notice.
They're too busy looking at the thing that you're pointing them to look at.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Do you think sometimes technique overwhelms purpose in miniature painting? Do you think people get too hung up on technique and lose sight of what it's for?
All the time. All the time. I think it's very, very common. The way that we teach people in miniature painting is technique first. So you're sitting down, then you teach people how to do shading or glazes or highlights or whatever else. Technique is the first thing that you teach people. And I'm guilty of that as well. Technique is very important to have in place in order to do the other things. But that means that everyone gets schooled in thinking of technique first, thinking of like how important it is to get smooth blends or whatever else your chosen technique is, and everything else gets forgotten alongside. And so when I go to competitions, I think the most interesting things is not in the master category; it's in the standard category, because those are the people who are much more free. So they aren't as encumbered with technique and with everything being neat and um, sort of living up to our shared standards. You can much more let the ideas and sort of your fancy of the moment shine through, and you get a lot more of that in the standard category. So when you come up with an idea, you have this little spark of an idea. That's sort of the center of what you do. You see some documentary or a painting or something like that, and that spark is what is best about your piece. So it's the core value of it. And the longer time you spend on that piece, the more difficult it is to keep connecting to that spark of the idea. So if you spend 200 hours, it's so easy to let that idea be buried under many, many layers of perfection and uh, doubt and all kinds of other things. But that idea is so important to keep because it's what gives your piece life. And lots of the really well painted things, they lose that spark. And there's so much more of that when you don't develop too much into the technique, when you don't pay too much attention to everything being perfect. It's much easier to keep it fluid and alive and keep that spark. So I think that in many ways, technique is the what an antonym, the opposite of what I want. I'd much rather have like non-metallic metal is something that everyone does right now, and it doesn't matter too much if it's really well blended and painted, as long as the light is in the right locations. The light placement and the light location, the reflection from the metal, it is much more important for those to be in the right place than them being neat. And it's very difficult to keep those locations if you are too busy with technique.
I've observed sort of fashions in technique about 10, 15 years ago. Contrast got really extreme where all the highlights were white and all the shadows were black.
Yep.
And there was actually very little in between. Figures started to look almost black and white
Yeah.
in the super high contrast era, which thankfully seems to have been killed by the high saturation color
Yeah,
in fantasy mostly,
yeah,
because it was more of a historical miniatures thing. But also, as you say, we've got the non-metallic metal is the fashion, or has been the fashion for a few years,
yeah.
and perhaps it's beginning to fade a bit now. Do you think there are fashions in color as well?
Oh, definitely, definitely. So in the fantasy side of things, we have like a Spanish school. There's a very, very strong, very good community in Spain, and um, mostly it stems from Jose Palomares, who is the CEO of Big Child Creators, and he's taught a lot of people, and they have taught a lot of people. So most things stems from this person, and the way that the Spanish people paint, it is very saturated, and they're using a lot of the same colors, and they're painting in that way because it's extremely effective. It's a very quick and very good way to get cool looking, good looking box arts. Um, and there's definite fashions in colors as well. One of the classic examples is named colors. Like there's an ice yellow that everyone uses. There's a deep sea blue that everyone uses. Those are fashion colors. Um, for the old school crowd, there's a goblin green that's very fashion based as well. And fashion is all set by the top level of painters, or the most like the grouping with the strongest impact and the strongest sort of sway over the community sets the idea of what colors to use. Right now, there's a lot of green red contrast. Uh, we had an area with a lot of orange and teal contrast, and we're sort of moving out from that. So there's definitely fashion, but also there's fashion in just more colors. The bit that you talked about, that miniatures used to be black and white, and now they got really, really colored. When I did my space camel, it's like 8 years ago or so, I put it into the contest in Monte San Savino, and it was just super fucking colorful. Everyone gravitated towards that because it was just bright orange and like so colorful. And most of the other things were relatively dull compared to that. Then, like 4 years later or so, I took it to the World Model Expo and put it into the competition at World Model Expo, and it fit quite in because everything else was super colorful as well. And seeing that change has been really exciting. And I think that changes happen really, really quick in the fantasy crowd. We're sort of going through all the different periods of classical art. Like we're going through naturalism and realism and surrealism and all those different movements with their associated color choices. And we're just sort of fast forwarding through them because we already know that all of it exists. And we're getting to sort of impressionism right now, where people are much more about painting the ambience and the color setting and the mood of the piece.
I've even seen it with the style, because the sort of the highly blended style is given way slightly to sort of pointillism and stippling
Yeah,
in transitions and stuff like that. So even the sort of impressionist painting
yeah.
technique is coming through as well.
We mostly have one person to thank for that, Alfonso Raldes, who marketed Fox Smoothness because he's a Spanish guy and he's loud and brash. But he's really the one that pioneered the idea that not only should everything not be smooth, but it's actually better if it isn't. And I'm totally on board with that. I think that if everything is smooth, if everything is done to the highest level, then like if everyone is super, no one is. If everything is super saturated, nothing really is. So that contrast between smooth and rough is very important. As important to me as with colors. But you started by asking where my inspiration for colors is. And a lot of what I do is not go full ham. Because if you make a relatively dull piece, it's not a bad piece. It's just a different decision. You could do a very desaturated piece. And if you do those things, then you have the option to add a little dash of full saturation somewhere. So if you do like a British waterfront in the fall, everything is going to be gray and brown. But it affords you the possibility of doing a little child with a very red apple. And then everything will be about that apple, or the ball cap, or the football, or whatever. So you're steering focus and you're steering narrative with the color choices.
Have you seen the film Don't Look Now
No?
with Donald Sutherland? It's a 70s film, and it's worth watching. It's really interesting because it does what you say. The whole film is quite drab and dark.
Yeah.
Even though it starts off in England and it goes to Venice, it's quite dark. It's about a couple that whose daughter dies in an accident, and they go to Venice to try and sort of, with his job, to try and get over it. But he's haunted all the time by the color red because she was wearing a red coat when she died.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the one bright coat in the film, and it keeps the one bright color, and it keeps popping up all the way through the film as this kind of motif until it ends with quite a shocking end.
Yeah.
With another person in a red coat. But it's similar to what you say, because the rest of the film is grey and brown and black, that red really jumps out the whole way through. So
yeah.
that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? With color in framing as well, that you can kind of use that as long as you create the right conditions between saturation and desaturation.
Yep.
You can use that very, very effectively.
Yeah. And if you're tied down by certain things having to be a certain color, you don't have that freedom. So that's the main reason why I don't want to subscribe to that. Is that I want to have the freedom to place the color where I can use it most effectively.
I've also seen a fashion in the last few years as well with the high saturation thing, that all of the colors are turned up to 11.
Yeah.
And that has a similar kind of effect to them all being dull, if you see what I mean.
Well, it's developed, the Spanish style is sort of what is pushing that agenda. And the Spanish style is developed to be very eye-catching in the social media age that we're in now.
Yeah.
So basically, it's made to be memorable when you look at it for 1/2 second. That is its purpose. And then it needs to be turned up to 11.
Yeah, I can see what you mean when you're scrolling on Instagram.
Yep.
If something comes up that really jumps at you.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is its purpose. Just like the Games Workshop style is developed to be showcasing miniature shapes and surfaces.
And to sell Games Workshop paints.
and to sell Games Workshop paints. But that's the Games Workshop paint selling thing actually comes second to that.
Yeah.
Primarily, it's designed to showcase miniature shapes. It's why they do highlights on the outside of all the volumes instead of where light would naturally fall. It is to showcase, hey, this is the shape. It's from here to here.
I think it's also, without getting too off subject again, but it's also about making it easy to paint for kids and for people that have whole armies to paint quickly.
Yeah, definitely.
The sculpts are very much designed for that, aren't they? They have very strong edge shapes and what have you to make them easier to paint, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been painting quite a few recently. As I said before we came on, I play with my son. Compared to historical miniatures, they're so easy to paint.
Yeah.
Because all the folds are very sharp or very defined. All the weapons, all the details on them are very defined.
They're made specifically so that 12 to 14-year-old boys can paint it.
And they can get reasonably good at it quickly and not be discouraged.
Yeah. And especially with the contrast paint that they developed specifically for that. There's another podcast, I'll send it to you later.
Hi listeners, I'd just like to pause the interview there while I tell you that the video that Tue is referring to is from the channel called The Painting Phase, and the episode in question is Contrast Paint Saves Games Workshop from Bankruptcy. I will put a link to that in the show notes, so I do recommend you go along and look at that. It's a really interesting conversation video, and probably one of the best podcasts I've seen in this hobby sphere. So do check it out. Now back to the interview.
They have a Games Workshop product developer with an interview that talk about the basically the excitement curve of painting, where when you sit down and paint, you have to paint for a long, long time before it looks good.
Yeah.
And that's what they made contrast for. It's for it to look good after 10 minutes instead of 4 hours.
There's a phase on miniatures that you always go through, and when I spoke about it on small subjects, Jim DeRogatis came up with the perfect phrase for it: embrace the suck, where you go through a stage on every miniature where it just sucks.
Yep.
And you just think, why am I doing this? And where am I going with it? And it's just awful. But you have to kind of trust what your plan is and get through it.
Yep.
But that's something you learn after years of painting, that's part of it, and you don't need to worry about it. You just need to keep going.
Yep.
For new painters, I would think kids wanting to, particularly when they got a squad of 10 Space Marines to paint, the suck is the kind of thing that can stop them painting.
Yep.
So anything you can do to take that away
Yep.
is a good way to keep people buying the product.
Yep. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about buying the product. It's a way to keep people happy about what they do, content with their results, the enthusiastic about doing it again.
Well, the best way to keep people buying it is to make them enjoy it,
Yeah.
or to help them enjoy it.
Yep.
So if they're enjoying it, they'll keep coming back. Yeah.
I mean, Games Workshop is a major part of why we actually have a community. Games Workshop doing a fantastic job getting people into it, and have been doing so for years and years and years. If it wasn't for Games Workshop, fantasy painting wouldn't be like nothing near the size that we are now.
I have to agree. So we've talked about the sort of the color and what role that can play in framing, and we've talked a little bit about desaturation. Do you just use desaturation to create the contrast against saturated colors, or do you use it in other ways as well?
So desaturation is it's a very, very good way to set the scene, like the mood of what you're doing. So you can invent an environment like a cyberpunk environment where the ambience is really bright. Like you could paint a miniature that's entirely magenta, and then here and there you're painting something different. But most of the environments that we think of, they're relatively desaturated. So when I look at miniature painting, like if you look at a surface for miniature painting, I sort of put it into three categories. So there's a shadow area, a midtone area, and a highlight area. That's true for all miniatures. I use the shadow area for a setting, for ambience. So most of my miniatures, there's the same color in all the shadows. It's going to be a relatively desaturated color, and it sets sort of the scene for it all. So if I paint the ground orange, the shadow color will be orange brown. If I want to do an ocean scene or like a foggy scene, it's going to be like a bluish gray color. And all the shadows are the same color, no matter what material or whatever. Then the midtone, I use that for material information. It's where I do textures, it's where I do color, it's where I inform people about what the specific shape is made out of and what its properties are. The top section, the highlight section, sometimes the middle section bleeds into that, but the top section is mostly to manage focus. So it's where I can introduce higher value in order to pull attention, and um, it's where I describe shape and volume and sort of the hardness of the material. So if it's a hard material, you want sharper, smaller highlights on those areas. Whereas if it's a wool coat, you want a softer one. So those are the ways that I use the different surfaces. And that is true for every surface in every piece. And I use all the desaturated colors in the shadows. I don't want black shadows. For some things, a black shadow would be good. I've done some experimentation with cell shading, and in cell shading, you need all the colors, all the shadows to be black. But I think desaturation is an extremely important tool in order to get coherency and in order to have some surfaces be like support surfaces and other ones be focal surfaces. So if I want to paint like a green soldier guy with a red beret, then I will make sure that the red beret is just about the only thing that's really red in the scene because it's what I will be using to pull attention to the face. But I will also want some reddish things somewhere. I'll want reddish brown boots or some clay ground he's standing on, something else. It should be red, but it should be a desaturated red because that will be like the color foundation for the red beret to be really red. Because if you do a scene that's only got the red beret as the only red thing, it's going to be quite brittle and feel quite alone. Because what you talked about music actually earlier, that you need the bass, you need the treble. Otherwise, the high points they'll just feel brittle and tinny. So that's where you need the desaturating colors in order to support the really saturated ones.
Who do you think in the miniature world uses colour best? Who do you look up to, admire?
Oh, that's a good question. Many different painters have their different strong points. I think
Mm.
Eric Swinson is really, really good with light and shadow.
Yes, yeah.
Um, I think Arno Lathro is very, very good with very subtle colors, introducing some pink into the skin tones, some blues and greens into. He's very good with subtleties. Um, I think Mark Masklans is very, very, very good with textures and sort of balancing that. Um, I think Kilkanaev is very, very good with metal. We all know that, but that's just the fleshy part of it. I think the way that he does like realistic textures and skin tones, and especially the way that he does really subtle lighting, is really, really fantastic. So
He's really good with desaturated colours
yeah,
as well.
yeah, he is. He is. Um, I think there's a lot of different painters that have very strong talents in their specific field. I and I admire all of them for what they do, and I want to be all of them for what they do. But there's really none of them that does everything that I want to do.
Mm. I think they would probably say the same thing. I mean, if you are all different, you're all individuals, and you all have your own vision
Yeah,
of what a great miniature would be. So yours isn't going to perfectly align with theirs, but there are things about them that you can say they're really great at that. That's something they do exceptionally well.
yeah, and all the people that I mentioned there, they have a lot of things in common as well.
Mm.
So none of them will paint a material in just one color. So if the character has a blue shirt on, the shadows and the highlights are not going to be blue. They're
Mm.
going to be something different. They're going to be reflective of the atmosphere, of the wear of the like the highlights. You can do a lot of like if you have a wool coat, if you do light desaturated colors, cold colors, then it's going to look more new and crisp. And if you do brighter, no, not brighter, less bright, browner colors, then it's going to look more warm. You can do the same with the shadows. But none of these people, and myself neither, will paint a material just one color. I find that really boring.
You mentioned there about ambient color. I think that's one way you can use color for storytelling. Is there other ways you think that color can be used to tell a story?
Beyond the ambient and beyond using it to draw attention to the story.
Mm.
Um, so the classic example is Schindler's List. So there's a girl in Schindler's List, funnily enough, in a red coat. And that's the only bit of color in that movie.
Yeah.
Uh, Actually, Jaws is maybe a better example. So Jaws use yellow. So whenever there's
Mm.
something yellow in the frame, the shark is nearby.
I'm
So,
gonna have to watch it again then.
so if you go through the movie and look for yellow, then you'll only see yellow when the shark is nearby. So it's sort of a subconscious danger signal that you can go for.
I think storytelling on miniatures can be very difficult because you don't have the diorama setting to put it in.
Storytelling on single miniatures is very, very difficult.
But I know it's something you love to do, right?
Yeah. I went to Poland about a month ago to go to
Mm.
Contrast,
Yeah.
and I saw a miniature there from a relatively new painter called Veronica, and it's a fairy, but it's a fairy with acne.
Hmm.
So it's a fairy with unperfect skin.
Mm.
The piece is called "Why Can't I Be Pretty Like the Other Fairies?" And it's a really, really good way to storytell. It's such a small thing that is being introduced. It's such a small tool, but it tells a lot of story about that character.
It punches like 100 emotional
Yeah,
buttons
it does.
about coming of age and about beauty standards and not fitting in. There's a
Yeah,
lot going on there, isn't there?
yeah. So you can do storytelling in single figures, but it's way easier if you have some more going on. Um, I don't actually think that it's very difficult to do storytelling in single figures, but I think the range of figures that we have access to that are good storytelling canvases is very small. Because you can no problem do storytelling in a single figure, but all the miniatures that we have access to, they're made for production. And for production to be successful, it needs to have a very broad audience. And so you can't really make things that are too pigeonholed into one thing. So they get more neutral, and therefore they're very hard to use for storytelling. But if you make a miniature specifically with storytelling in mind, it's not a problem to do it with just a single miniature. So I think that it's not that people are bad at it. I think that our available palette to paint on is bad.
Mm. Why do you think we make miniatures? Why do you think we do it? It's a very odd thing when you think about it to sit there and paint tiny things.
It's one of my favorite topics, actually. Um, I think that a lot of people have very little agency in their life, and they need somewhere where they can decide. And that might, a lot of people do it for escapism, a lot of people do it just to have a joyful moment in their life, a lot of people do it because they're swallowed up by this super, super over busy world that's constantly fighting for your attention, and being able to just put all the social media, all the other stuff aside, lets you focus, and that's why they do it. It's why I think it's very important to have a workshop, to have somewhere where you can go, where you can't see the dirty dishes. Um, a lot of people,
I can see the dirty workshop.
yeah, but it's your dirt.
Yeah. Everything's exactly, all the crap's exactly where I want
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and I know where else everything is.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people paint miniatures. Um, I wouldn't. I think self-indulgence is a weighted term, but I think it's actually what it is. It's having the opportunity to do this thing just for you, whereas everything else we do for everyone else. I think there's a lot of value in it as well, because it gives you, oh, it sounds almost religious and stuff. Um, it lets you have a a calm mental moment where you can just focus on one thing and let everything else sort of flow away. It lets you escape from a very busy world and just focus on one thing. It's almost like uh, yeah, exactly. It's almost like meditation. Um, it's a very mindfulness thing to paint miniatures, and I think that the need to be very precise and very controlled in that is very good for that one thing. I mean, meditation, a lot of meditation is about controlling your breath. And that's not really because controlling breath is important. It's just an important tool. It's just a convenient tool. The breath is something that every person have, at least while they're still conscious. So breath is it's the same for everyone, and it's something that everyone has that they can focus on. Whereas sitting and painting miniatures is not something that everyone has. But I think it's got the same function. It demands 100% focus in order to get it right. That means that your entire frontal lobe can do that thing, and then everything else in the subconscious can just relax and let go.
It's I'd say it's funny you mentioned breath because painting has fucked my breath up. Because I quite often now find myself in front of the TV at night holding my breath because I'm used to doing it for painting. So it's actually giving me breathing problems I need to work
Wow.
out. Don't you do that? I know a few other people that do that. You get so used to holding it when you're painting a tiny detail that you find yourself holding your breath at other times.
I don't think I paint enough fine details to do that, actually. So the vast
Well,
majority of my paint is either done with an airbrush or with like size broom brushes, really, really big flathead brushes, and I just mash paint on it. And then maybe 5% of my paint time is cleaning up and making stuff neat.
wow. Sounds like a really good way to work.
It's very freeing.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else we should talk about?
um, I don't think so.
I think we've covered it for now, but we've opened a lot of doors that I'd like to explore another time.
Yeah.
So if you would come back on, that would be
Oh,
fantastic.
definitely.
We'll book that sometime in the
Yeah.
future.
There's plenty of topics that I would like to discuss. Maybe tell people that being brave is very liberating.
Mm, take risks.
Yeah, not just risks. Uh, do what feels right instead of what you've been told is right.
Mm,
So paint bravely. If you feel like the uniform should be more green, if you feel like this person should have red skin instead of pink skin, do it. It's a very freeing experience, and it's very it's liberating. And sort of staying too focused on what we think is right, especially what, like staying too focused on what we think will get our peers recognition, can get in the way of our personal enjoyment. And it's very difficult to get out of that. And taking chances and just doing whatever you feel is fine is a good way to do that. Probably my most common thing right now is that everyone paints for results.
mm,
So whenever you sit down and paint a miniature, the expectation is to have a finished miniature that you can show to others, either it shows or online or something else. That's the declared, in quotation mark, correct final result. But it means that everyone needs to be high performance, because all of it needs to be a high quality, because you're putting your name and you're putting it out, and everyone can look at your stuff and judge how good you are. So if everything needs to be about producing a finished result, there's no room to play around. So painting miniatures without the express need to have a finished product. Just painting something because you feel like painting it, or because you're curious about this color, or because you're inspired by this movie you just saw. I think that's so important. And I think that when people do that, they should definitely show it to everyone else, because it shows that they they have the freedom to do things that are not perfect, and you should as well. But that constant, it's definitely about the social pressure to perform.
It's internalized gatekeeping, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
You're gatekeeping yourself based on what you think others are expecting.
Yeah, and everything is about performance,
Mm.
and you want to show people that you can perform. It's like if you go running and you're going to this running event, and you can either do the full marathon or you can do half a marathon. So if you go for the full marathon and you drop out halfway, you're a failure. If you go for the half marathon and complete it, you're a winner.
Hmm.
And effectively, it's exactly the same thing that happened.
You've run the same distance.
Yes, you have. But just the perception of completing and
Hmm.
performing is so ingrained. But just painting stuff for the hell of it, just because you feel like painting it. Play with colors, even though you're not painting stuff the right colors. If you want to paint a German tank green, do it. I know that people will crucify you if you paint a gray Sherman, but if you think that it would be fun painting a gray Sherman, do it.
I think I've said this a lot, and I still stand by it, that finishing is overrated.
Yeah.
Modelling and painting, it's not about finishing things and having them to look at in your cabinet. It's about the act of doing it. And as long as you're doing it, then you're doing it right.
Yep.
The finished things are a byproduct.
Yep.
The joy comes from the act of sitting there doing it, not having done it.
It's funny that you should say that. I think that every miniature that you start has a purpose. It's got something that
Mm.
it needs to show you, and that purpose is sometimes finished before the miniature is, and that's fine. You don't need to finish miniatures in order to finish the experience. But then you can't show it to your mates, and you can't show it to everyone online, and then
And you can't make money from it.
no, no.
All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I hope people would have got a lot out of it. I think it creates as many questions as it answers, which is my favorite kind of chat. So
Yeah,
thank you
mine
for
as well.
joining us, Tue.
Thank you for having me.
What a conversation. I think it made a superb pair with Jean's interview in the last episode, and like all the best conversations, it really got me thinking about it long after recording. You can find out more about Tue on his Facebook page or on his Instagram. If you see him at a show, I highly recommend you get chatting. He's a wonderfully enthusiastic guy who really thinks deeply about this craft. During this interview, Tue mentioned the piece Why Can't I Be Pretty Like Other Fairies by Veronica Gallas. I want to read you what she posted when she posted the photos of this piece on Instagram, because I think it's important to share a voice like Veronica's. Veronica Gallas can be found on Instagram under the username picky._.painter. Why can't I be pretty like other fairies? As a young girl, I didn't fit into beauty standards because of terrible skin changes. I left the swimming team and absolutely quit on my favourite sport. All because I was too ashamed of my body. Popular culture did a trick on us. It shaped our perception of beauty and made many of us, well, quit on things and ideas we love because of how we look. As a little girl, I learned from movies and tales that good and virtuous lady has to be incredibly beautiful. I also learnt pretty fast that I don't fit into those beauty standards. If I were to take the part in a tale, I would play a foul witch, not a fair princess. I quickly learned to associate, or rather confuse, beauty with goodness. For me, body positivity is not only about feeling good in my natural skin, it is about making stories and images like this more common. I'm really happy that my Acne Fairy received such a great response at Contrast Painting Festival. To be honest, I was a little uneasy about this entry. Thank you for all the kind and warm words. You gave me courage to create more. Thank you, Ignis Art Miniatures. The sculpt was a great inspiration for me. I think Veronica says something really important there, not just about beauty standards and about our society, but also about modelling and figure painting. That we often co-opt those standards of beauty and standards of physical image from other things in our culture and use them pretty much without contemplation or question. I think it's really important that we can use our figures to tell more truth and to tell more of a story about how it really feels to be who we are. And I think it's a really fantastic example of what can be done with this art. I hope the message is one that reaches as many people in this hobby as possible. Before I go, I'd like to thank my Patreon patrons. The Plastic Scholar, Lee, Warren, Eddie, Frank, Robert, Stephen, Christian, Carlos, Paul, Bruce, Shafe, Pascal, Flip, James, John, Eric, Matt and Dennis. I really do appreciate all your support and the support of our sponsor, Scale Model Challenge. If you would like to support the podcast and blog, please go to patreon.com/themodelphilosopher. Don't forget, you can read the blog with lots of images, including the fairy and all the images we discussed in this episode with Tue, and a link to that YouTube discussion, fantastic one about Games Workshop and contrast paints, at themodelphilosopher.com. That's it for this time. Next episode, I'll be discussing realism and accuracy with David Parker, and I hope you'll join me for that episode. Take care.